when you peer very carefully underneath, and you really have to get down on your hands and knees to see this, you can see a second sculpture of Alice. And this one is a cadaver of Alice being devoured by worms and maggots with the flesh falling off her. It's a reminder that however successful in life, we are all equal in death. My name is Hannah Skoda. I'm Medieval History Fellow at St John's College in Oxford, where I teach and research late medieval history. And this is a History Extra Academy course on late medieval England. And today I'm going to be talking about family and community in late medieval England. Family begins with birth. And childbirth in the Middle Ages was terrifying. Medical interventions were obviously extremely limited in their efficacy, and maternal and infant mortality were extremely high, probably around 30 to 60%. But women didn't just suffer, they sought solace and support in childbirth. This is an image of a late medieval charm. And importantly, this is not evidence of male medical expertise. This is evidence of women looking after one another. It's a truly extraordinary survival from around 1500. It's now in the Wellcome collection. It's MS 632. So it's what we call a birthing girdle, presumably to be tied around a woman's belly during labour. And the text on it tells us that, I quote, "If a woman travailing with child girds this measure about her womb, she shall be delivered safely without peril." And this is written not in Latin, but in Middle English. Scientists from the University of Cambridge have used biomolecular analysis to find traces of cervicovaginal fluid actually on the parchment. So it's an amazing piece of evidence that this bit of parchment accompanied a medieval woman through the terrifying experience of childbirth. These kinds of charms and amulets didn't suddenly appear in the later Middle Ages. They had a long and complex history. But they're a really important witness to the pain and suffering of women in childbirth, to their courage, but also to their search for support and female solidarity. The 14th century French physician, Guy de Chauliac, who certainly considered himself an expert, bluntly described textile amulets as appealing primarily, quote, to women and idiots. But he's really missing the point. We also have evidence of spells. And by the way, this is not yet a period of the persecution of witches. Rather, it's a period in which people were searching for a range of solutions which drew on the interconnections between the natural and the supernatural, and which were not mutually exclusive with organised religion. A manuscript in the British Library, Harley 585, reads, "This is my remedy for hateful slow birth. This is my remedy for heavy difficult birth. This is my remedy for hateful imperfect birth." And this spell was supposed to be recited while stepping over the grave of a dead man. It doesn't seem particularly practical in the middle of labour, but anyway. The charm goes on, "Up I go, step over you, with a living child, not a dead one, with a full-born one, not a doomed one. By Christ I have said, this is manifested." And this last phrase was apparently to be said before the altar in the church. So it was the pregnant woman herself who was supposed to speak this charm. Her pregnancy and her womanhood gave her a voice in this particular ritual, where she takes responsibility and agency in her own safe passage and healing. After the birth, a woman was to lie in for a certain amount of time, after which she was to be quote-unquote churched. So this means that 60 days after the birth of her child, the new mother ceremonially crossed the threshold of the west end of the church, reintegrating herself spatially into the community of the parish. She would then have approached the altar at the east end to be blessed according to a special liturgy. And in making her way to the east end, she would have had to walk through and amongst the members of the whole parish community. This was more than stepping over a threshold, it was an act of re-inclusion. And this tells us something else really important about medieval family life. Childbirth is dangerous, families were deeply patriarchal, but this was also all about community. The family unit was not isolated. It had a place in the wider community. In the late 13th century, a little boy crawled out of his crib whilst his parents were at a funeral in Conwy in North Wales. The curious toddler crawled out of the house through the dark and tragically fell off the drawbridge and into the moat. A passerby spotted his lifeless body, and this stranger swiftly prayed and promised a pilgrimage to Hereford if the miracle-working late Bishop Thomas Cantilupe would help. And of course, Thomas Cantilupe did help. The saint revived the little boy, who began to suckle at his mother's breast. And the whole community was there, helping, looking on, celebrating. Parenthood was about being part of a wider community, and often a rather affectionate one. The French historian Philippe Ariès made a famous argument some decades ago that childhood wasn't really a thing in the Middle Ages, that children were just treated as mini adults. But stories like this show us that this really wasn't the case. Children were treated as human beings with their own delightful idiosyncrasies and needs. Certainly, there's a lot of cruelty towards children in this period. It's a period in which people think corporal punishment is largely a good idea. But nevertheless, we can sense these really affectionate and loving relationships which exist right across society. And the horrific levels of infant mortality did nothing to undermine parental love and the cherishing of family ties. Of course, we mustn't adopt too rosy a glow of medieval families. Medieval marriage was not necessarily a happy state for women in particular. Medieval medical theory claimed the inferiority of women. So Aristotelian theory saw women as defective males, sort of inside out, so that the vagina was effectively an inverted penis. And this was set alongside ideas from Hippocrates, Hippocratic theories about the four humours. Apparently, if men were hot and dry, women were cold and wet. And this meant they were apparently physically weak, changeable and fickle, too emotional and sexually voracious. And theological ideas reiterated this kind of medical framework to argue that women should be subject to men and that marriage was really about submission. It's a period when domestic abuse was rife, and we know about this as much from literary sources as from legal sources because, of course, it was so rarely prosecuted. And in many cases, we find that men were actively encouraged to what they called discipline their wives. So the lines between discipline and abuse were drawn very differently. But this doesn't tell the full story. Domestic abuse actually produced a great deal of disquiet. Penitential manuals, so these are manuals for use in confession to help people decide what penance to impose. Penitential manuals really decried the effects of domestic abuse. And women, of course, weren't simply despised. In any case, they were obviously quite capable of speaking up for themselves. If the great villain, or the great female villain of Christian history was Eve, who tempted Adam to eat the apple in the Garden of Eden, then the great heroine of Christian history was the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of Christ. And Eve and Mary had one thing in common. They were both mediators. The one wicked, persuading Adam to do something dreadful, but the other virtuous, speaking up on behalf of humanity as an intercessor. So this is an image of the Virgin Mary in the Wilton diptych. It's a gorgeous late 14th century image showing King Richard II praying to the Virgin Mary as an intercessor. And for earthly women too, this sense that women could be mediators was a very powerful ideal. Even within oppressive structures, there was a sense that women had a really key role to play, and that they certainly did. A wonderful example is the story of Philippa of Hainault. She was the wife of King Edward III. When the besieged town of Calais in northern France finally capitulated during the 100 Years' War in 1346, Edward agreed to spare the inhabitants if 6 of the burghers of the city would offer themselves up for execution. And his wife Philippa interceded on their behalf. So again, it's this model of woman as intercessor. The chronicler, Jean Froissart, waxes lyrical about the episode and about how wonderful and generous-spirited Philippa was in persuading, successfully, Edward to spare the lives of these men in deference to the generosity of his wife. For some women, marriage represented a significant possibility for social advancement, and there are some amazing stories of social mobility in this period. This is the tomb of Alice Chaucer. It's an extraordinary so-called trancy tomb in the village of Ewelme in Oxfordshire. Alice was born in 1404 and she died in 1475. And her name, of course, is particularly meaningful to us as the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer. But Alice was a magnificent individual in her own right. She married 3 times, ever more grandly, culminating in a marriage to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. And they were then honoured with the most noble Order of the Garter in recognition of her and her husband's friendship with the royal couple. So Alice's tomb lies in the church at Ewelme, and in this village she established institutions effectively to care for her parishioners from cradle to grave. There's a school, which you can see here, in continuous operation since 1437. And there's a set of almshouses for elderly parishioners, again in continuous operation since 1437. Alice's tomb is a splendid monument, but it does something even more interesting than just commemorate her worldly success. Because when you peer very carefully underneath, and you really have to get down on your hands and knees to see this, you can see a second sculpture of Alice. And this one is a cadaver of Alice being devoured by worms and maggots with the flesh falling off her. It's a reminder that however successful in life, we are all equal in death. Alice's foundations at Ewelme, of course, are another really important reminder of the importance of community in this period. Families operated in a wider context of communal living. Unsurprisingly, the negative side of this is that it often produced a suspicion of strangers. But it's also a period of growing migration and immigration. A wonderful recent Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project uncovered the extent of this. The numbers are phenomenal. 64,000 names of people have been found who are known to have migrated to England during the period of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death, the Wars of the Roses and the Reformation. In the middle of the 15th century, around 1.6% of York's population was born outside of England. In the 15th century, approximately 1 in every 10 people in England was foreign born, and in London it was 1 in 6. The amount of immigration then declines really in the second half of the 15th century, probably because of declining economic fortunes. but it's a very, very interesting picture of very mobile societies. Why did people come to England? Many were fleeing war from the Netherlands, in particular in the 14th century. There were more economic opportunities after the first outbreak of the Black Death. Lots of Flemish weavers, in particular, came to London. Really interestingly, mortality rates in Flanders were lower than in London, which is strange given that population was denser there than almost anywhere else in Europe. They were also attracted by the fact that Edward III permitted them to set up their own weavers' guild, which meant they could control their own business. Tailors, glaziers, brickmakers and shoemakers were among the many who crossed by sea to the southeast of England. Craftspeople came from Ireland, Scotland and France to fill a wide variety of occupations, from saddle makers to goldsmiths and bakers. The Jewish community had been expelled from England in 1296, and after this we see an influx of bankers to England from other areas in Europe. Domestic servants often came from Ireland, France and Scotland in particular. What all this reveals is that families were usually mutually supportive units at the heart of society. Families were deeply patriarchal, but this doesn't mean that women were silent or passive, quite the opposite. But late medieval society was also emphatically built on community, and this was a community which was rapidly changing and adjusting. And next week, we're going to think further about the theme of community by looking at political community.